In 1941, the wind howled through the snow-covered plains of Russia, biting at the faces of the men who trudged forward, their faces etched with exhaustion and disbelief. In the shadow of a war they could no longer understand, they carried the weight of a defeat unlike any they had ever imagined. The once mighty Sixth Army had fallen. Stalingrad, once a symbol of their strength, now lay in the hands of the Soviets, and with it, the dream of conquest across the East. Amid the wreckage, Major Wilhelm Albrecht stood in silence, his boots heavy with the weight of mud and snow. His uniform was torn, its insignia barely visible against the grime of battle. His mind was a storm of thoughts, memories of what had once been. The proud marches through France, the victories in Poland, the belief that they were invincible. Now there was only the bitter taste of defeat, of knowing that the impossible had happened, and the Germans had lost. Albrecht had fought in the streets of Stalingrad, had watched as the city burned and crumbled under the relentless Soviet counterattacks. He had heard the screams of men who had fallen, soldiers whose faces he would never forget. He had witnessed the desperation in the eyes of his comrades as food ran scarce and the cold gnawed at their bones. Yet, through all of this, there was one image that haunted him most. General Friedrich Paulus, a man of steel, his once unflinching resolve now crumbled beneath the weight of defeat. Paulus had refused to surrender, even as the encirclement tightened. It was a refusal that had cost them dearly 91,000 prisoners, tens of thousands dead. Stalingrad was more than a battle lost. It was the death of the German dream, a dream fueled by blind ambition, now reduced to dust. The decision to hold Stalingrad, to fight to the bitter end, had been Hitler's. It was he who had sworn the German forces would never retreat, who had refused to hear any counsel that spoke of withdrawal. And now, here they were, broken, shattered, caught between a past they could no longer claim as their own, and a future they feared they might never see. Albrecht's hands shook as he lit a cigarette, the glow of fleeting comfort against the freezing cold. Around him, men wandered aimlessly, their faces vacant, their eyes distant. Some had begun to speak in whispers, others in angry tones, questioning the leadership that had led them to this point. "We are betrayed," one soldier had muttered only a few hours ago, but even those words felt hollow now. The betrayal was not just from the leadership, it was in the very heart of the war itself. The relentless push east, the belief that victory was inevitable, had been shattered in the rubble of Stalingrad. Back in Berlin, the reality of defeat had yet to fully sink in. News of the surrender was met with disbelief, with denials from the higher-ups, but the truth could no longer be hidden. The German propaganda machine scrambled to frame the event, to spin the defeat into something more palatable. But the truth could not be obscured. Stalingrad was a catastrophe, both material and moral. The shockwaves would reverberate through the ranks for years to come. For Albrecht and his comrades, the defeat at Stalingrad marked the end of an era, the end of the belief that they could march through Europe with ease, that their victory was predestined. They had been brought low by a fierce adversary who would not relent, and it was hard to imagine how they would ever rise again. The Soviet soldiers had proven their resilience, their will to fight for every inch of land. As Albrecht walked among the remnants of his unit, his thoughts turned to Hitler's response. He had been furious, of course, and raged by the defeat. But it was Manstein, one of the few generals still trusted by Hitler, who would soon step into the fray, offering what little hope remained. A plan for a counteroffensive, a chance to strike back, to regain the initiative. But for Albrecht, this seemed like little more than a pipe dream. What remained of their strength? What remained of their pride? The frozen landscape around him seemed endless, and for the first time in his life, Albrecht wondered if this was truly the end. Not just for him, but for Germany itself. There were no more easy victories on the horizon. Stalingrad had proven that. And as he stared into the empty night, the question echoed in his mind. Could there still be victory, or had the dream of conquest shattered forever? As the men gathered their things, preparing for the next phase, whatever that might be, Albrecht knew that this war, this brutal, senseless war, would change them all. It had to. They were no longer the unstoppable force they once believed they were. They were broken. But the real question, the one that no one dared speak aloud, was whether there was any soul left in them to rise again. And in the distance, a German aircraft buzzed overhead, a haunting reminder that the fight was far from over. But for Albrecht, the battle had already been lost. The real war now was one that would rage within the heart of every man who had lived through the hell of Stalingrad. Would they rise, or would they crumble beneath the weight of their own shattered beliefs? The days following the surrender at Stalingrad were filled with a strange silence, one that fell heavily over the shattered remnants of the German army. The rumbles of artillery and the cries of soldiers had faded into the cold air, leaving behind only the eerie stillness of defeat. As the months passed, the war would continue to rage on, but for many, the fight had already ended in their minds. The dream of conquest, once so vivid and powerful, had crumbled in the ruins of a city that had devoured everything the Germans had thrown at it. In a small, dimly lit room at the rear of a hastily established command post, General Friedrich Paulus sat alone, his back stiff against the hard chair. His once proud uniform hung loosely on his thin frame, his face gaunt and weary. He had given everything to this campaign, every ounce of energy and determination. Yet here he was, a prisoner of war, a symbol of Germany's most humiliating defeat. It was in this quiet despair that he wrote, his hand trembling as he scrawled a letter to his wife. His thoughts, scattered and fragmented, finally found their way onto paper. He wrote of the surrender, of the collapse, and of the betrayal he felt at the hands of those who had failed to heed his warnings. But it was not the tactical losses that weighed on him the most. It was the crushing realization that Stalingrad had broken something deeper within him. A faith in the war, in the Reich, and perhaps even in himself. The capitulation of Stalingrad is a catastrophe of the first magnitude for Germany, he wrote. Not just a loss of material, but a loss of moral character. A defeat not of arms, but of spirit. Paulus, in his isolation, could no longer ignore the truth that had been slowly dawning on him during the long months of battle. They had been wrong from the very beginning. The Germans had believed they were invincible, that they could march into any city and bend it to their will. But Stalingrad had proven that the myth of German superiority was just that, a myth. They were not gods. They were men, and those men had been broken by a city, by a people who would not bow. As he set the pen down, he looked out the small window, watching the endless stretch of snow and ice. The German military was no longer the juggernaut it had once been. The men who had marched eastward with proud uniforms and defiant faces were now scattered, their spirit eroded. The pride had been replaced by a deep, gnawing sense of disillusionment, a feeling that no victory, no matter how great, could ever restore what had been lost in those brutal months of combat. Outside, the soldiers who had survived were returning, some limping, others silently trudging through the snow, their faces as gray as the winter sky. They had been through hell, and they were now walking ghosts, caught between the memory of the past and the unknown future ahead. The German forces, though still formidable, had lost something irretrievable, their belief in the inevitability of victory. One soldier, Private Hans Richter, wrote to his family in early March 1943, barely able to form words beyond his despair. "I don't know what to say," he wrote. "I thought we were invincible. I thought we were going to win. But now, I don't know what I believe anymore." The letter was a reflection of the collective heartbreak of the German soldier, a realization that what they had been told, what they had believed in with blind faith, had been shattered beyond repair. Richter's words echoed in the hearts of others who, like him, found it difficult to speak. But the feeling of abandonment was universal. Not just abandonment by their high command or by their Führer, but a sense of being lost in the world. There was no longer a clear reason to fight. No longer the rallying cry of a swift victory, of triumph after triumph. Only the bleak certainty that the road ahead was one paved with more bloodshed, and the doubt that they could endure much longer. The soldiers who had once seen themselves as part of an unstoppable force now questioned their place in this war. Were they just tools, expendable pawns in a leader's obsessive pursuit of power? Or were they, too, lost in a war that had consumed everything, even their humanity? Even in Berlin, the news of the surrender at Stalingrad was being framed and spun by the propaganda machine, but the cracks were beginning to show. The narrative was losing its power to convince the people, to raise their spirits. Hitler's promise that the German army would never retreat seemed to ring hollow now that the Sixth Army had surrendered. And as whispers of the catastrophe spread, the moral crisis began to ripple throughout the ranks. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, who had been one of the few to question the wisdom of Stalingrad's prolonged siege, now found himself in a position of desperate responsibility. He was tasked with steering the war effort forward, but how could one move forward when everything had already been lost? Manstein, ever the strategist, knew that the military decisions ahead would not be about fighting with the same fervor as before. They would be about damage control. Yet, even in his hardened heart, there was a shift, a realization that no victory could truly erase the shadow of Stalingrad. As the days wore on and the snow continued to fall, the German soldiers and officers alike were left to face a deeper, more troubling question. What was left to fight for? For some, the answer was clear: duty, honor, the belief that despite everything, the Reich still needed to be protected. But for many others, the question lingered in their minds, unanswered. Could they still believe in their cause, in the Reich, in Hitler? Or had the war become something altogether darker? A war without purpose, fought not for conquest but for survival. And so, as they trudged through the snow, the soldiers carried with them not just the weight of their equipment, but the burden of existential doubt, the shadow of Stalingrad haunting every step, every decision. The dream had shattered, but for the men still standing, there was only one question left to answer. How much longer could they keep fighting in a war that no longer made sense? The corridors of the Reich Chancellery echoed with tension, the sound of footsteps heavy on the cold marble floors. In the rooms where decisions were made, the weight of the Stalingrad disaster was suffocating. The German High Command had long been used to victory, but now, after the crushing surrender, there was an uncomfortable silence that stretched between the commanders. Hitler, standing at the center of it all, refused to acknowledge defeat. To him, retreat was not an option. His will was unyielding, his obsession with honor and prestige driving every decision. The Reich could not afford to appear weak. Not now. Not after the humiliation at Stalingrad. Inside the command room, the debate raged on. The voices of Manstein, Guderian, and others filled the air, clashing like metal upon metal. Erich von Manstein, one of the few generals still trusted by the Führer, was a man of pragmatism, but even he knew that the situation was dire. Stalingrad had left the Germans with nothing but a broken front line and shattered morale. It was a defeat that would take more than mere words to repair. But Manstein believed that if they struck now, quickly and decisively, they might still regain some of the initiative. "We are on the defensive, but we are not defeated yet," Manstein had said, his voice measured but insistent. "If we make the right move, we can restore some semblance of order to this chaos. But that requires speed. We cannot wait any longer." But Heinz Guderian, the mastermind of Germany's early blitzkrieg tactics, was far more cautious. He knew that their forces, though still formidable on paper, were overstretched and undermanned. The damage from Stalingrad wasn't just physical, it was psychological. The Wehrmacht was not what it had been. To risk another battle before recovering, he feared, could be disastrous. "We have lost more than just men and equipment," Guderian replied, his voice tinged with exhaustion. "We have lost the will to win. How many more soldiers can we send to die in the snow before we realize that? We need time to consolidate, to rebuild." But Hitler's response was swift, his tone brimming with that stubborn resolve that had defined him from the start. "A show of strength is what we need," he said. "An offensive. We must prove to the world that we will never yield, that we will fight until the last man. If we do not strike back now, we lose everything." The generals knew there was no room for hesitation now. The Führer had made his decision. There would be no retreat. A strike would happen, and the only question left was where. The decision came down to one key location, Kursk. A massive Soviet bulge in the front line, a region that offered an opening for a decisive counterattack. Manstein, ever the strategist, saw the potential. If they could cut off the Soviet forces at Kursk, they might be able to weaken the enemy's hold on the Eastern Front, forcing them to retreat and giving Germany a brief but critical reprieve. It would be a decisive blow, one that could restore momentum, both on the battlefield and within the German psyche. But others, like Guderian, weren't convinced. He knew that the Soviets had already begun reinforcing their position. The Red Army was growing stronger by the day, their numbers increasing with each passing month. The very idea of engaging in such an all-out offensive, without proper preparation and recovery, seemed reckless to him. Yet the decision was made. Operation Citadel would begin. The generals who had long served under Hitler now found themselves in an impossible situation. They could not question the Führer's decision openly, but the urgency of the situation weighed heavily on them. The soldiers, though resolute in their duty, had been reduced to mere cogs in a machine that had lost its bearings. The psychological cost of Stalingrad loomed over them all, and as the planning for the Kursk offensive ramped up, Manstein and the others wrestled with their growing doubts. Still, they pushed forward. Guderian sat in his office, staring at the map of Kursk, tracing the potential paths of attack with a finger that felt as if it didn't belong to him. It was hard to shake the sense that they were walking into another trap, that the Soviets were prepared for exactly this. The Soviets had learned from their previous engagements, adapting quickly to the Germans' tactics. The more Guderian thought about it, the more he realized that this was not just a battle for territory, it was a battle for Germany's soul. If they failed again, there would be no recovery. The spirit of the army, like the army itself, would collapse entirely. And with it, the dream of a German-dominated Europe would be dashed forever. Manstein, meanwhile, was already speaking to his officers, preparing them for the assault. His mind was sharp, his instincts still intact, but even he couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling that they were heading into something far greater than a military conflict. This was a test of character, a test of the German will to fight. There was no room for mistakes. There could be no more Stalingrads. The decision to fight at Kursk was more than a military strategy. It was a desperate cry for redemption. As the preparations moved forward, the mood in the German high command became more urgent, more charged with a sense of impending conflict. The generals, despite their differing views, knew one thing for certain. The war had reached a crossroads. It wasn't just about retaking ground. It was about recovering their honor, about preserving the image of a German army that had once been feared across the world. Hitler's obsession with victory, with restoring Germany's prestige, had left the generals with no choice but to act. The question wasn't whether they would strike. It was how much more they were willing to sacrifice. As the cold, harsh reality of their situation settled over them, they knew that Kursk would either be their salvation or their undoing. And no matter how many voices of dissent spoke up, the wheels of war had already been set into motion. There would be no turning back. In the cold, sterile halls of the Reich Chancellery, Adolf Hitler stood before a map of the Eastern Front, his finger tracing the lines of retreat that would never come. Stalingrad had shattered more than just the German army's momentum. It had struck at the very heart of his vision for a victorious Reich. The defeat was a wound, and wounds had to be healed by action, by decisive blows that would remind the world of Germany's might. His obsession with pride, with reclaiming lost ground, was all-consuming. To retreat would be to admit weakness, to surrender to the idea that Germany was no longer destined to rule Europe. And to Hitler, such a surrender was inconceivable. A retreat was a death sentence, and accepting defeat was a luxury he could not afford, not when his empire's future rested on the myth of German invincibility. The Führer could not and would not acknowledge the reality of his situation. The loss at Stalingrad was a setback, not an end. In his mind, there was only one path forward, a counteroffensive. Operation Citadel was born not from strategic clarity, but from his unrelenting desire to restore the shattered reputation of his military, to prove to the world that Germany would never bow. He was a man consumed by his own narrative, one in which defeat was only temporary, and victory, no matter how costly, was always just within reach. Hitler's generals, however, were beginning to see through the veil of his delusion. Manstein, the ever-pragmatic strategist, was the first to speak up, his voice laced with reluctance. He understood the value of a swift, bold strike, but even he was beginning to feel the weight of Stalingrad's failure pressing down on him. The Sixth Army's destruction had left scars that would not heal with a single attack, no matter how meticulously planned. The Wehrmacht was not the same as it had been before. Guderian, the master of Blitzkrieg, was more forthright in his reservations. He had seen the state of the German forces firsthand, the depleted ranks, the worn-out equipment, and most importantly, the psychological toll that the defeat had taken on the soldiers. Morale was at an all-time low, and the Soviets were preparing for the German push with a determination that Germany could not match. The idea that a massive armored offensive could reverse their fortunes seemed increasingly reckless. Yet, despite the growing doubts, Hitler's command was final. The offensive would proceed, and with it, Germany's future would either be secured or irrevocably lost. There was no middle ground. His obsession with honor, with his vision of a German empire stretching across Europe, had taken root so deeply in his psyche that the consequences of failure no longer seemed real to him. Hitler's gamble had become Germany's own. As the war would soon reveal, Operation Citadel was more than just a military strategy. It was the climax of a man's hubris, his unwillingness to accept reality, and the blind loyalty of those who continued to follow him, even as the world around them crumbled. For Hitler, this was not a question of survival. It was a matter of pride, and pride, as history would show, is often the deadliest of all motivators. The days leading up to Operation Citadel felt like the eerie pause before a storm, where the air crackled with tension and the ground seemed to vibrate with the weight of the coming battle. The sun barely touched the horizon as German forces began to gather in the vast expanse of the Eastern Front, their movements a careful dance of logistical precision. Tanks, artillery, and soldiers flowed into position like a great river, a river that would soon surge forward in a desperate bid to reclaim what had been lost. In the war rooms, the plans were drawn, revised, and redrawn again. Manstein and Guderian, their once enthusiastic spirits now tempered with resignation, knew the scale of what was about to happen. The preparation was immense. Hundreds of thousands of men, tens of thousands of tanks, and an arsenal of artillery that stretched as far as the eye could see. Yet beneath the surface, the signs of strain were everywhere. The Wehrmacht was a shadow of its former self, and everyone, whether they acknowledged it or not, knew it. In the camps, the soldiers were preparing for what could be the final chapter of a war they had no longer believed in. The victory they had once expected was now a distant memory. Each day, the cold Russian winter bit harder into their bones. The men, bundled in their heavy coats, were silent. They had seen too much, suffered too much. Stalingrad had scarred them, and the haunting question that lingered in their minds was whether they were simply marching to another massacre. In the small, quiet moments before the storm broke, letters were written home. Private Hans Richter, one of the young men who had survived the horrors of Stalingrad, sat in the snow, his hands shaking as he penned a letter to his mother. "I don't know if we will make it through this one," he wrote, "but I want you to know that I am trying. I am trying to hold on, but sometimes I wonder if there is anything left to fight for." The letter was a reflection of the unspoken doubts that swirled beneath the surface of the army. The men were exhausted, not just physically, but mentally. They had followed their orders, fought the battles, and suffered the defeats. But now, as they prepared for what was to come, the grim reality of their situation was beginning to settle in. Was this last offensive truly a chance for redemption, or were they simply marching to their deaths, caught in the grip of Hitler's delusions? The officers, too, felt the weight of the coming battle. General Wilhelm von Thoma, one of the men tasked with overseeing the southern thrust at Kursk, spent sleepless nights reviewing maps and plans, his mind heavy with the uncertainty of the mission ahead. He knew the stakes, the future of the German military, the fate of the Eastern Front, and perhaps even the war itself, rested on the success or failure of this single operation. But there was no excitement, no sense of hope in his heart, only dread. As the final preparations unfolded, there was a growing sense that this was no longer a battle for glory. It was a battle for survival. And with each passing hour, the Germans knew the price of failure would be far higher than just a military defeat. Kursk would decide the future, and the weight of it pressed down on the shoulders of every soldier, every officer, every general. The calm before the storm was the quiet of inevitability, a moment where time seemed to stretch, holding its breath. The battle would come, and when it did, it would be the largest tank battle in history, a clash of titans that would test not only the strength of armies, but the resilience of men. And in that stillness, the question lingered. Would the Wehrmacht, so recently shattered, be able to rise once more? Or had they already lost the war before the first shot was fired? The tension in the air was palpable as the final preparations for Operation Citadel were set into motion. The wheels of war were turning, and there was no turning back now. Yet within the high command, there was an undercurrent of doubt that refused to be silenced. While Hitler remained fixated on the need for a decisive blow to restore German pride, some of his generals, those who had seen the horrors of the Eastern Front firsthand, could not ignore the mounting risks. Heinz Guderian, the architect of Blitzkrieg, sat with his staff, his mind a storm of conflicting thoughts. As much as he had once been a champion of swift, overwhelming force, he knew that the Germans could not afford another failed gamble. The loss at Stalingrad had drained more than just their manpower. It had taken their spirit, leaving a hollow shell in its place. The Wehrmacht was a fractured entity now, its morale at an all-time low. The soldiers were no longer the invincible force they once had been. They had been bled dry. A moment of failure here at Kursk could very well be the end of the German military. "We are not ready," Guderian had stated flatly to Hitler in one of their last meetings. His voice was measured, but the urgency was unmistakable. The army is broken, and the Soviets are growing stronger by the day. The men have no belief left in this war. The tanks are our only advantage, but even they are not invincible against their defenses. We cannot win this fight if we march into it blinded by our own pride. Erich von Manstein, too, felt the weight of what was about to happen, but his commitment to the mission and his loyalty to the Führer prevented him from voicing the same level of concern. Still, the doubts lingered in his mind like a shadow. He knew the Soviets had fortified Kursk heavily, anticipating a German offensive. Could they really break through those defenses with the weakened forces they had left? He'd seen the strength of the Red Army up close during Stalingrad, and he feared the same fate awaited them again. Yet, despite the reservations of men like Guderian and Manstein, the decision had been made. Hitler had insisted on the offensive, clinging to his belief that only an aggressive show of force could restore the honor of the Wehrmacht. And so, the generals begrudgingly fell in line, though their voices of dissent echoed in the quiet moments of planning. As the tanks rumbled toward Kursk, some wondered if this would truly be their salvation, or if it was already too late. Could Germany afford another defeat? Was this the beginning of the end for the Third Reich? The night before the attack, a deep stillness hung over the German lines as the soldiers prepared for the largest tank battle in history. The darkness seemed to press in, thick with the weight of the upcoming battle. Some soldiers sat in silence, writing letters home, knowing that they might never have the chance to send them. Others quietly checked and rechecked their weapons, the uncertainty of the next day gnawing at them. Private Hans Richter, his mind heavy with dread, lay awake in the cold, damp earth. The night seemed endless, the quiet broken only by the distant rumble of artillery as the final preparations continued. Kursk, the site of the great German gamble, was now only hours away. The air was thick with fear, but also with an unmistakable sense of determination. These men had been through the worst of the war, and now they stood on the precipice of another battle that could decide their fate. Would they rise to the occasion, or would the weight of their failures crush them? Richter's thoughts flickered back to Stalingrad, to the moment when the realization had first settled in that they were not invincible, that the war might be lost. But now the stakes were even higher. If they failed at Kursk, it would not only mean the collapse of the German military in the east, it would mean the end of the war. No more gambles, no more opportunities to recover. In the German command tents, the mood was similarly tense. The generals, once sure of victory, were now faced with the reality that their forces were insufficient to guarantee a win. The calm before the storm seemed more like an oppressive silence, a moment of reckoning before the tide of history surged forward. When the artillery finally roared to life at dawn, it was not just a barrage of metal and fire. It was the sound of an entire empire holding its breath, hoping that this strike would be enough to turn the tide. The tanks of the Wehrmacht surged forward, cutting through the Russian fields like a tidal wave. The first wave of attack was meant to break the Soviet defenses, to create a gap through which the rest of the forces could pour and encircle the enemy. But as the hours passed, the initial confidence began to fade. The Soviet defenses were more formidable than expected. The minefields, the anti-tank ditches, and the heavy bunkers slowed the advance, forcing the Germans to fight for every inch of ground. Each gain came at a terrible cost. The first few days of the battle were a blur of smoke, blood, and the sounds of screaming soldiers as the German tanks engaged in brutal combat with Soviet armor. From the Soviet side, the battle was equally intense. The Red Army had prepared for this moment. Marshal Zhukov had anticipated the German offensive and set up a defense that was almost impenetrable. Soviet tank commanders like Dmitry Lavrenenko rose to the occasion, their tanks cutting down German units with precision and fury. In the chaos of battle, the psychological toll became evident. The German soldiers had once been the fearless conquerors of Europe, but now they were unsure, uncertain, questioning whether they could overcome the defense in front of them. The initial confidence had turned into disillusionment as the Soviets fought back with an intensity that was unmatched. As the days of battle dragged on, the Germans began to realize the bitter truth. The Soviets were not merely defending, they were fighting to win. What had seemed like a quick victory was now an exhausting struggle. The Germans had hoped that their overwhelming force would be enough to push the Soviets back, but instead, they found themselves trapped in a battle of attrition. The tank-on-tank combat that had once been the hallmark of German victories was now grinding to a halt, as Soviet T-34s and KV-1s held their ground, fighting with a desperation that matched the Germans. The tactical superiority of the German tanks, once considered their greatest strength, was now being undermined by the sheer numbers of Soviet forces. And worse, the weather was turning. Mud and rain began to slow their advance, and the heavy tanks bogged down in the mud, easy targets for Soviet artillery. The Germans' morale was deteriorating. Private Richter, who had once believed in the inevitability of victory, now found himself questioning everything. The battle that had begun with the promise of redemption was now a nightmare of grueling combat, and every moment that passed brought the realization that they were not going to win this battle. The Soviets had anticipated their every move, and the Wehrmacht was being crushed under the weight of its own overconfidence. By the time the dust finally settled on the battlefield at Kursk, it was clear. The Germans had lost. Operation Citadel had failed. The offensive, once believed to be the last hope for Germany to regain the initiative on the Eastern Front, had collapsed under the weight of its own hubris. The Soviets had not only held their ground, they had repelled the German forces and launched their own counteroffensive. The psychological toll on the German soldiers was staggering. The men who had once believed in the invincibility of the Wehrmacht now understood the harsh truth. Their empire was crumbling, and Kursk was the nail in its coffin. There would be no more victories, no more quick triumphs. The dream of German dominance had been shattered. As the German high command came to grips with the failure, they were faced with the bitter realization that their strategic mistakes at Kursk had sealed the fate of the Eastern Front. The cost of their decisions would be measured not just in lives lost, but in the irreversible loss of momentum, of hope, and of Germany's place in the war. Kursk had not been just a battle of armies. It had been a battle for the very soul of the German war effort. And by the end of it, it was clear that no gamble, no matter how grand, could restore what had already been lost.